Hey guys, this here is the last part of a 3-parter collab with RPG Tales and Artificial DM. I will have links to their respective parts in the description and in the cards at the top right, so make sure that you have watched part 1 and 2 so you have a little bit more context. And if you haven't noticed, this video is quite long compared to the other two, so I'm going to have timestamps if you want to skip ahead a little bit. But without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, wow! Thank you so much to everyone who has been reading and commenting and listening so far. I never expected it to get this much attention, and I've had some really nice messages and comments from people. I really appreciate everyone engaging with this story, and before I dive into this third and final part, I want to address some relevant questions I've had over the last day or so, for the sake of clarity. First off, yes. He was on the autism spectrum. I could tell, and he later confirmed it himself later, which comes up here. And no, this did not automatically creep me out or make me uncomfortable. I'm friends with many autistic people, and have memory sensory-related problems potentially related to it myself. So I don't automatically dislike or mistrust people who have ASD, or other disorders that affect social skills. Even though back then I wasn't diagnosed, I was very careful about what I said and how I reacted to certain situations. I always try to be extremely clear about my personal boundaries, and what I'm feeling and why I'm feeling that way. It takes a lot to make me angry or frustrated to the point of blowing up, which is why the confrontation after the bar made me feel a bit guilty. Given the fact I was hugging a lot of people there, it's reasonable to think that he assumed I was fine with any and all physical contact. But the way he went about it really rubbed me the wrong way. As mentioned before, I always ask before engaging in platonic physical contact with other people, especially if I haven't hugged them before. And this was a practice I performed very openly with him in the general vicinity. So the fact that he got into my personal space without asking really upset me at the time. The reason I didn't hug him at the bar with everyone else wasn't just because it would have made me uncomfortable, but he was also stood off to one side on his phone as we were leaving, so it wouldn't have made sense for me to go over and say goodbye to him specifically. Secondly, someone had asked me how old we were at the time of the story, and I realized I forgot to mention it. We live in the UK, so we were all legal drinking age here. I myself was 20, and I believe most of the group was around the same age. Mavis was a couple of years older than me, and the Sorcerer and Rogue were both 19. Both of the DMs were a few years older than us, late 20s or so, and the problem player was around 25, which was a few years older than me, but still younger than the DMs, I think. He was living with his parents, and, to my knowledge, had never moved out. And at this point, I was temporarily living at home looking for a new place to rent on my crappy income. And housing is expensive, so I didn't really think too much of it. I don't really care if people live with their parents for a long time. It was really hard for me to save up enough for a deposit, and even then, making rent meant I was living on the breadline. I was just in an awkward living situation, and felt more comfortable with my own space. In retrospect, I think he was also very sheltered, and relied on his parents to do a lot for him. I don't think that helped with his social skills. Some people have mentioned how he might have felt left out of the group, and that could have influenced his actions. I agree that he was pretty much different than the rest of us, but I feel like that was something that he did on his own. He had plenty of opportunities to engage with us during the game, and outside of it in person. We always made our meal and snack run plans in the group chat, and openly asked who would be coming along, and he never seemed interested in talking with any of us. But we never left him out of a session, or out of a game activity on purpose. The one exception is the bar, which I'll get to. And lastly, for those asking, thank you. I'm fine now. Nothing too awful happens in the story, but the warnings are there because they do come up a bit in detail. I don't know if this is sad to say, but it wasn't actually the worst experience that I've had with creeps like this, before or since. It's just the biggest one related to RPG and D&D stuff specifically. This happened almost 6 years ago, and I'm a much stronger and happier and healthier person. If I actually had some backbone then, things probably wouldn't have escalated this much. But I don't blame myself or anyone else, other than the problem player, for how things went down. He was given plenty of opportunities to change his behavior, and had specific things explained to him calmly and in great detail by both myself and the DM, without it really changing anything. One example of which you'll see in this final part. Now with that out of the way, let me finally get this over with. This is the lengthy conclusion of how a D&D creep stalked me at work, belittled me online, refused to listen to my personal boundaries, and ultimately got himself banned from every consecutive local game space in my area. As the last part left off, I was pretty nervous about going in for the next session. I'd had a couple of days to cool off after the incident at the bar, and I felt bad about being so in his face. Despite all the red flags, I thought to myself that he'd probably misread the situation, and that I'd embarrassed him by calling him out so angrily. I could have done such in a much calmer way. I was just really flustered by being misgendered and approached in the dark. I also figured that he might have meant the lady stuff in good faith, or at the very least, didn't realize he was being rude. Because Finley was a boy, and all of us, except the sorcerer, played characters that matched our identity. I reasoned that he might have thought people using he to refer to me at the table was because my character was a boy, and he hadn't actually grasped the whole trans thing. Despite me and the rest of the group being quite vocal correcting original Bard in the beginning. Maybe he had never heard of the concept before. Like I said in part 1, Rogue was also trans, but she passed very well. She had long curly hair and dressed in very fashionable and girly clothes. She also had a very feminine name, whereas mine was masculine, but it could also be considered ambiguous in some cases. And no, it's not Dave, as my username suggests. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it's just a reference to a fandom I was in for a long time, and the username just kinda stuck around. Shout out to those who get it. Anyway, to cut a long explanation short, I basically talked myself into downplaying my creep senses, and basically nothing too bad had happened at this point. I thought it was pointless to bring it up to the DM and the rest of the group. However, my instincts were definitely correct, and I should have trusted them more. But I actually felt bad for being so distrustful towards him. He cheated at the table and had some strange habits, sure, but it was obvious that he had pretty bad social anxiety on top of his ASD, and maybe the rest of the group would encourage him to be better. I had decided that after the next game, I would try and calmly explain to him why I felt insulted, and why what he said and did upset me so much. I had 2 days to sit on it, so I felt like I'd gotten my thoughts in check by the time we all met up for our next session. As promised, after the last staring incident, the DM had set up the table so that I was in the corner, with the rest of the group built around me. Instead of taking the far end of the table, he sat somewhere in the middle and set up an open chair at the end. It meant that whenever PP arrived, he had to take the seat farthest away from me, something he looked a bit put off about. I noticed that the sorcerer was also acting subtly standoffish to him, which was weird because he was very extroverted and normally at least said hello, or asked how his father was doing. PP rarely answered outside of a grunt, and I decided not to say anything, but it struck me as very odd. I was honestly a little out of it. I was a bit nervous about confronting him, and I kept role-playing what I wanted to say over and over again in my head, so I don't fully remember exactly what was going on in the game itself. But 2 things happened that do stick out in my mind. The barbarian DM wasn't able to make the session, so we were down a tank, and we were facing a mini-boss, a huge, hulking bodyguard leading a small army of raiders. If we wanted to get through the fight, we'd have to be sneaky about it. So I had Finley, who was becoming quite a lot more confident in his abilities, approach the mini-boss when he was on his own, and get his guard down and cast Charm Person on him. He convinced the guard by referencing his poor working conditions and crappy employer to help us in our fight, which was now much, much easier. The DM didn't seem that put out. He actually had a lot of fun giving the character a very loud and hearty voice, reminiscent to Lord Flashheart from the Blackadder TV show. After the combat was over and the spell was beginning to wear off, the DMPC got him in handcuffs ready for trial at the guild. Finley reprimanded him for taking such a shady job in the first place, and through some persuasion and very lucky intimidation checks, and by lucky I mean he was a 4'0", meek-mannered deer man with a -3 to intimidation. The bodyguard was both humbled and impressed he had been bested. He was convinced to consider joining our cause instead, as a chance to work off his misdeeds, after a trial and investigation. It was obvious to all of us that the guild was pretty shady on its own. The DMPC, by this point, had some ties in high places, and could essentially rig the trial to let this happen. After the group had agreed that this would be an appropriate way to handle things, this later became a kind of trend for Finley. But the DM didn't mind as long as it was not game-breaking. In fact, he liked this gimmick so much that one of the first pieces of loot I had got was a buff to my Charm Person spell. The other thing that happened was that at some point, Problem Player's character was injured in the brawl, despite his stupidly high AC, and I decided to heal him, along with everyone else who had gotten hurt. He had been looking down at the table for pretty much the whole night, but this seemed to brighten him up a little bit, and he even had a quiet sentence or two to say to the NPCs as we were returning to the guild. The game ended with the outcome of the trial. Finley, who was quite the flatterer and had managed to get in good graces with the higher powers that be, suggested an outcome for the bodyguard, if they would be so kind to consider it. And as luck would have it, things went smoothly, and he went to inform the bodyguard of his new job, working in the small farm he had been renovating with assistance from the guild. It was simple work, but it paid decently, and as Finley had somehow managed to amass quite a lot of money without caring about material possessions enough to spend it, later on he ended up becoming a multimillionaire, thanks to a very lucky draw in a deck of many things. But at this point, the farm was very bare bones and needed a lot of work. It was a pretty good outcome for everyone involved, and the mini-boss engaged in some casually flirtatious dialogue with my character, which I didn't mind, and I reciprocated in an amused way. As we were packing up, I started to get really nervous again. I stated that I needed to use the bathroom, which I kinda did. I had to splash some water on my face to psych myself up, and by the time I came back, the rogue was waiting for me and everyone else had headed off upstairs. We usually hung out for about 10 or 15 minutes outside of the shop after closing, chatting about non-game stuff. While Problem Player usually walked right away, this time he stood about 15 feet down the road, away from the rest of the group, looking down at his phone. I knew his dad would probably be there to pick him up soon, so I told the group I just had to talk to him about something real quick, and walked over. He looked nervous and didn't really look up from his phone until I asked if I could talk to him about what happened the other day. I kept my voice quiet as I still didn't want the rest of the group to know what had happened, and I didn't want to embarrass him over what I thought was a misunderstanding. He didn't really say much, and I was shaking so bad I didn't actually get my point across as well as I had wanted to. But I hit pretty much everything I wanted to say, and I explained to him that referring to me as she and a lady was very hurtful, and that I was a trans man, and that even if he didn't understand what that was, he should respect it. I very clearly stated that I was a boy, and that what he had done, and said, made me feel uncomfortable. But I understood he was trying to be nice by offering to walk me to my bus stop. I briefly explained that I have personal boundaries that I don't like people crossing unless I know them well, and I felt like he was a stranger since we didn't really talk or interact, either in the game or out of it. I asked him to please not to refer to me as a female again, and that I hadn't meant to get so angry at him, but I had felt threatened by the way he approached me and tried to touch me out of the blue. I think this actually upset him quite a bit. His face went blank and pale, and he stared down at the ground. I very quietly reassured him that I hadn't told the DM or the other players on what had happened, and I didn't plan on doing so. I just wanted him to understand that he'd made me feel uncomfortable, and why I didn't want him to do anything like it again. I asked him if he understood, and he nodded, mumbling sorry, very quietly to me. As far as I was concerned, that was that. I went back over to the rest of the group, and he got back to texting, probably messaging his dad, because he left for the car park behind the shop immediately afterwards. The rest of the group gave me some odd looks, and someone asked if it was okay because I was shaking. But I smiled and told them everything was fine. I just wanted to talk to him about something, and it was no big deal. I felt relieved that I had been able to explain myself, and that I seemed to get through to him. For a few days, I just kinda let myself forget about it. I was working long hours at this point, and it was usually until about 10:45 p.m., so I didn't tend to check my phone very much during the day, and I was working so hard that I didn't really let myself think about it much. There was a lot of other stuff to worry about, so dwelling on something I thought was resolved didn't make much sense to me at the time. It was Saturday night, and we normally played on Tuesdays, and when I was locking up, I had noticed that I had a message request on Facebook. PP wasn't my friend. In fairness, neither was the Barbarian DM, as I didn't really hang out with him as much. But he must have seen my profile on the group chat. The message preview was very long and nonsensical, but it sounded like it might have been an apology. So I opened it, and what I read was, "No word of a lie, a solid paragraph about 700 to 800 words per message, and around 3 or 4 messages in total. I've long since deleted all of our conversation and blocked him forever, but I still remember most of what he said to me. It had started off with a long non-apology about how he didn't think it was fair for me to call his behavior threatening. He said that he would never assault someone, and I had just misunderstood. He was just trying to be nice and escort me home because there are some men who would take advantage of you like that. Which, I know, dude. Why do you think I was so nervous about someone approaching me in the dark? He went on a long ramble about how he has autism and anxiety, and how I was the one being rude and disrespectful for taking offense to things he can't control. By saying I felt threatened, I had made him have a panic attack as soon as he got home, and he was starting to feel like the whole group hated him for it. I debated sending a message back all the way home. It was quite a long bus ride, but I was in knots trying to figure out how to proceed, so I decided to wait until morning. The next day, I calmed myself down and wrote back a relatively long but to-the-point message. I actually felt pretty bad that things had gone this way. I even blamed myself a little bit, wondering if I had somehow messed up in explaining myself again. I started off by telling him that I didn't dislike him for his autism or his anxiety. I have many friends who are on the spectrum, and I've had anxiety myself at the time, so I would never automatically judge someone for having those things, or for being awkward in social situations. I didn't mean to cause him harm by addressing his actions, and I reiterated that I had felt uncomfortable because I hadn't known his intentions. He had crossed a personal boundary with me, and he'd scared me because I didn't want people touching me without asking. I understood that he didn't have bad intentions, but that didn't mean I automatically felt safe around him. He apologized again, but tried to blame it on me for misreading his actions, and ultimately said that he didn't understand why we couldn't just be friends. I just told him to drop it, and that if he couldn't understand why I was upset, then he should at least respect what I was telling him if he genuinely wanted to be friends with me. He didn't message me back for the rest of the day, but on Monday I received another long series of messages, this time about things that were entirely unrelated. There's a couple of things that I missed out on saying earlier, so I'll mention them here when they become relevant. Back when Diem was trying to get some background stuff from us, I said in the group chat that, although I was new, I had been making many OCs and text-based roleplay characters for years, and if anyone wanted help with the background stuff, I would be happy to talk to them about it, and would try to work out the kinks. He didn't take me up at this time, but Sorcerer and I had some really interesting conversations about Regina's backstory, and gave her some great motives for being evil outside of just the fun of it. I didn't do much outside of give a suggestion here or there, but I think it helped, and the player was happy for my input. Mavis and I also talked a lot about our backstories together, and I found it helped me pinpoint the finer details of Finley's motivations and goals from his journey. At this point, the offer had happened months ago, so it was pretty much out of the blue for him to suddenly message me about his character's backstory. He said that he wanted to get closer to the group and play his character better, and he wanted my help establishing stuff with him. I actually thought that this was a good thing, and we had something to talk about other than the awkward incident, and I figured that this might finally help him integrate more with the group. If he could talk with them, maybe he wouldn't single me out as much. I, of course, was wrong to be so optimistic. His next long ramble was not about his backstory, but about how he wanted to flesh out his character with mine. He began talking about how he thought my character and his character should be in a relationship because mine was so frail and helpless, and his was a worthy and honorable knight. And I mean, this went on easily for 3,000 to 4,000 words. He prefaced this by saying that my character should be a girl, because Finley was so weak and useless anyway that it didn't make sense for him to be a boy. I don't remember everything he had put, but I do remember him distinctly writing,
"A girl should play girl characters anyway. It's weird that you want to pretend to be a boy, in-game as well as real life."
He just went on and on about how his character was this amazing protector and would treat her right. If only she would notice how great he was. He even went into weird detail about what their kids would look like and how she could be a stay-at-home wife, since it suited her character so much better. Most disgustingly of all, he went into great detail about how his paladin was a well-trained lover, but still a virgin, and would keep himself pure for her until they got married. He'd woo her with gifts until she fell for him, and he would become a great fighter to keep her happy. I was very, very angry by this point. Not only did he disrespect me and my character, but everything he had put forward didn't make any sense at all. He had been told, and it had been reinforced many times, that I was a boy. I told him that Finley was my character to play however I wanted, and I had no interest in forcing a romance between him and any of the PCs, let alone one who he has had no interaction with, and doesn't know at all. And not only was he ignoring everything I was telling him, he was being so rude that I didn't want to talk to him at all. He seemed surprised that I reacted so badly to this. I think he was actually trying to compliment me, because he said something along the lines of me being too cute to be a boy. I had talked openly at the table about how I was interested in men, and he decided to bring this up, saying it was stupid for me to pretend to be a boy and try to date boys when they'd only be interested in me as a girl anyway. As hurtful as this was, it was stuff I had all heard before. It had become pretty obvious during this conversation that he had some sort of crush on me, and this was probably his way of trying to deal with it. I should have blocked him, but I told him he'd really pissed me off, and I didn't understand how he could be this dense and ignore everything I was saying in favor of his own twisted narrative. He told me he was just upset that I didn't seem interested in talking to him, and that the DM was trying to push him away from me. I don't know where he got the impression that we were even friendly to begin with, but I was so mad that I blew up at him. I told him that he was ignoring me and my identity to the point where it wasn't just disrespectful. It was ignorant as hell, and he needed to back off and give me some space if he actually cared about my feelings. It was getting very late at this point, and I had to be at work in the morning before our session, so I decided to just leave it there. I told him not to contact me again unless he was ready to be polite, and that if he said anything else, I would be asking the DM to kick him from the game. The next day, I woke up to a string of about 10 messages, all of which were the same sort of massive, nonsensical paragraphs, starting at around 3 a.m. and running all the way to 8 a.m. I didn't even read any of them properly. I just skimmed through them as I got up and did some chores before heading to work. They were all really self-deprecating, talking about his poor mental health, and how D&D was the only real social thing he was doing, and how he had no friends. He said his social anxiety made people hate him without getting to know him properly, and he didn't understand why I didn't want to be friends with him, and stated that he was just confused about my gender, and asked a lot of inappropriate questions about my body and how it worked. He demanded that I talk back and explain more about the things that he didn't understand, as if I was the sole encyclopedia of trans knowledge. He talked about how he'd never had a girlfriend, and he didn't know how to talk to people, and how he'd never met a transgender before. So I shouldn't be so upset at him for not getting it. He was going to prove to me that he was a nice guy, and that he just wanted to be friends. I was so scared about answering any of this that I decided not to say anything back. I didn't know what else to do. I debated just telling the DM everything, but I decided I would hold off until after our session. It was probably too late for him to change things, but my shift ended at 5 that day, and the session started at 6:30. So I decided to meet up with the rogue for coffee beforehand. Just the two of us. She noticed that I seemed really off, so I admitted some of what had been going on, and let her look at a couple of the messages he had been sending me. But I didn't let her see all of them, though. I think she only saw the ones about the backstory, and a couple of the more frustratingly dense ones. She was really angry, and I found out at this point that he hadn't been invited out to the bar last week. Nor was he friends with either the rogue or the sorcerer on Facebook. So he was either a friend of a friend, or he added them with a fake profile and stalked us to the bar. She also admitted that she had picked up on the fact that he might have a crush on me, but didn't want to say anything because she knew it would have made me uncomfortable. We decided that we would go to the DM together after the game and tell him that we didn't feel comfortable playing in the same game as him. She reassured me that I hadn't done anything wrong, and that this was entirely because of his own prejudice and disrespect. If I talked to the DM about it, he would absolutely take my side and do something to protect me, and if for some reason he didn't, she would do something herself. In the end, we didn't even have to talk to the DM. I was in knots waiting for PP to arrive, but Rogue held my hand under the table, and I think this is when our friendship really started to get closer. PP showed up that day, took his seat at the head of the table, and proudly, if quietly, proclaimed to the group that his new miniature had arrived. A custom Hero Forge mini of his paladin, that he painted himself. The rogue and I shared a look, and we both knew this guy was probably about to get kicked out of the game altogether, so this was incredibly poor timing. And then he reached into his bag again. Now there's something I didn't mention in one of the earlier parts of the story, and in retrospect, I think it gives a lot of context as to why what he did next made me so very angry. Very early on, probably the first session after the bard was kicked, I was still borrowing dice from the other players, and they were pretty cheap to get. But nobody really minded me using them, and I always asked first. Anyway, he showed up to the session, which at this point I hadn't even spoken to him beyond an introduction, and dropped a still sealed set of dice on the table in front of me. The game shop sold them for about £3 a set. I was meaning to get my own, but I hadn't gotten around to it. I asked what it was, and he just said it was a present, so I didn't have to take other people's dice. I thought that this was weird since he hadn't given anyone else anything, and was so stingy that he didn't even share his snacks at the table. But I figured he was just being nice towards a new player, and after the session, I quietly told him that I appreciated him getting them for me, but that I don't really like people spending money on me, or giving me presents, especially if I don't know them very well. He seemed confused, and didn't push the issue, and it never came up again, until now. And dear listener, from that backpack, he pulled a second miniature, a beautiful, custom faun woman, with long, flowing hair, breasts out for all to see, painted in explicit detail, nipples and all. And he slid that mini across the table towards me, and I knew for a fact that this was not only expensive as hell, but he had to have ordered it weeks ago, since it would have been shipping from the States. The rest of the table was in shock, and I think they might have been waiting for him to pull out more minis, as if he had somehow saved up enough to splurge on a gift for all of us. But no, it was just me, and this fat-racked female, Faun, that looked absolutely nothing like my character. I, of course, passed it right back and told him that I didn't want it. It didn't look like my character, and I didn't want to take any presents from him. And I was embarrassed. I could feel myself going bright red, from shame and anger. And nobody except the rogue knew what went down between us, and she still didn't know what had happened after the bar. I had promised not to mention it, and in some way I felt tied to that promise. I felt like I couldn't make a big scene here, in front of everyone. Not just my group, but also a bunch of other tables. I couldn't just leave, and he refused to take the mini back, even though I was obviously angry. I didn't want him to flip out on me, so I pretended to take it. I sat it in front of me, and I didn't touch it for the rest of the session. I didn't even look at him. I was so angry that he had trapped me in this crappy social contract where I had to just keep my mouth shut, or risk looking ungrateful. And I don't think he understood, or cared, just how awful this had made me feel. We did actually have a map for that session, and instead of taking the mini out of the plastic he gave me it in, I used a spare die. He didn't say anything, but I think he realized then just how angry I was at him. As the session had ended, he went to the bathroom, leaving his stuff on the table, and we all looked at each other, and without saying a word, we packed our things up as fast as humanly possible. I don't think I've ever rushed through putting my things away that quickly. I left the mini on the table, along with the rest of his stuff, and we all booked it upstairs before he came back. Instead of waiting outside, the DM had marched us all down the street, and said that he was officially kicking PP from the game. I was so relieved that I could have cried. I didn't have to make a case against him, and I didn't have to show the DM the messages or explain anything else that had happened. In that small action, he and everyone else knew that PP had crossed a serious line. He asked me how I wanted it dealt with, and I asked if he could make it seem like it wasn't my fault. So he sent a message in the main group saying that he had to disband due to coursework, which he was doing a PhD or a master's, I believe, and that the game was officially off. He then made a new group chat, and we had made plans to move our game to Mavis's house instead. I was so relieved that I actually cried when I got home. I was so drained by everything that I figured I would never have to talk to him again. I blocked him without responding to his messages, and Rogue told me that she and Sorcerer went through their Facebook friend list and removed any profiles they thought might be fake, just in case. And that was very much the end of it. A week later, I was in on a closing shift, which meant I was in from noon until around 10:30. We closed at 9:45, and the rest of the time was spent cleaning the place down for the next day. It was a pretty crappy job with crappier pay, but I quite liked the end of the night. It was very chill, and the assistant manager I was closing with was a good friend by this point. So we put on some dumb music and danced around while we cleaned. I was near the back cleaning the toilet when she said that there was someone outside knocking on the window. We had big windows looking out into the street, and she could see them looking in. I didn't pay much attention, but shortly after leaving to poke her head out and tell him that we were closed, she came back in looking confused with something in her hand. "He said this was for you?" she said, handing it over to me. It was the miniature, still wrapped in plastic. When I looked up, PP was there, still staring at me through the window. I was horrified. All of the other shops on our street closed at 6, including the game shop we usually played in. It was only on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays that it was open in the evening. So he had either been ambling around town for hours, or had come to town specifically to do this. It hadn't occurred to me that he must have known where I worked. I probably mentioned it during an early session, and didn't think much of it, but I was actually scared at the realization that he could come in and see me any time he wanted to. I didn't think he would actually do something, but the idea was terrifying. The assistant manager noticed how tense I was, because she suddenly looked really concerned, and I told her in a very firm voice that I would be right back, and that she should watch in case something happened. I marched right to that door, miniature half crushed in my fist. The street was dark and pretty much empty, but I knew the assistant manager would be watching, so I felt bold. I asked him what the heck he wanted, and what he was doing at my workplace. He backed up and got really defensive, mumbling and stumbling over his words, as he said he just wanted to see me, and that I had left my mini behind. To which I threw it at him. Everything inside of me just sort of snapped, and I started venting at him about how he had no respect, no manners, and no regard for my feelings, and that I genuinely hated him, and that if he ever wanted to try to come to my workplace or talk to me ever again, I would call the police. I was shaking and full on yelling at a dude who was shrinking back more and more. He wouldn't even look at me, just mumbling about how I was wrong. He even reached out and tried to hug me, and I pushed him so hard that he almost fell over. And at this point, the manager rushed to the door. She wasn't much bigger than me, but she was a loud Scottish woman who could be incredibly intimidating if she had to be. She yelled at him to get away from her employee, or she would call the police. And that was what made him finally scramble away and take off down the street. I think I was genuinely in shock for a few minutes. She took me inside and locked the doors, and we sat in the back room for a while. I told her a little bit about what had happened leading up to this point, and showed her some of the messages he had sent. I could still see them, even though I had blocked him from sending more. I cried, which was really embarrassing, but she gave me a hug and told me that everything would be okay. And she was so angry, her face was turning bright red. And she started saying that she was going to go out there and find him herself so she could shake him down and tell him to leave me alone. But I told her not to bother. My last bus was at 11:15 p.m., and at this point we had about 20 minutes to lock up and for me to rush to the stop, which was about a 10-minute walk away. So we locked up and sent a message to the manager about what had happened, and the assistant manager and her boyfriend, who met us at the shop, walked me to my bus stop. We pulled an image of him from the CCTV, and the manager had reassured me that he was officially banned, and he would be kicked out if he tried to come by again. I must have scared him off because he never came back to my workplace. A few months later, I started working in a call center outside of town, so even if he did, I wouldn't have been there. The game went on peacefully for a few more months. The DM was amazing, and Finley went on to have some great adventures with our unlikely party. In-game, the paladin was killed off in a pretty humiliating way for being a traitor to the guild, which I think was his way of trying to make me feel better, and it worked. He pulled some amazing ideas out of what was once a bare-bones backstory, and by the time we split, he had saved his friends from an evil hag, made his fortune and fame by reforming a small army of ex-criminals on his bountiful farmland, and eventually became the new leader of his old commune, moving them all to his new home to live in peace. Eventually, we disbanded due to work commitments, but we all stayed in touch. I didn't actually stop playing, although I took a long break after this campaign. All my groups after that were with friends I knew already. Sorcerer had moved back to Ireland, and both DMs worked abroad for a year. The Rogue and I are still great friends to this day, and I still see Mavis regularly at my new job. What is that job, you might wonder? Well, a couple of years after packing in my job at the old playspace, a position opened up at the shop right across the road. A certain, small, independent nerd shop, who just so happened to need a new person to take over events, including D&D. Given the fact I used to work right across from them, I had gotten to know the manager and other workers quite well, enough for them to consider me for the position. And readers, you can bet your bottom dollar that I grabbed that opportunity with both hands. I poured every last one of my negative experiences with creepy players and toxic nerds, and made sure I was running the safest dang playspace I possibly could. With the manager's permission, I was able to not only bring back D&D, which had fizzled out sometime after I stopped playing there, but I was also able to introduce clear and strict harassment policies that meant nobody would have to go through what I did. And as a sweet final note, around the back end of last year, before COVID shut everything down, guess who wandered into my shop? Ponytail Paladin, of course, right behind a guy who must have been his father. The second he saw me, he went pale and quickly turned around, pretending to look at the shelves. He didn't say anything as his dad approached the counter, and asked me if we happened to have any running D&D games that his son could join in with. I gave him my brightest customer service smile and told him that we were full, but if he wanted to be put on a waiting list, that was possible, as I oversaw the events and all he would have to do was read and agree to our code of conduct, which was printed quite nicely right by the entrance to the downstairs basement. I had never seen a guy leave so fast, and I have a feeling that he won't be back. I briefly told my manager in private that he had stalked me and harassed me at my previous workplace, and she unequivocally told me that if he ever came back again, that I should point him out so she could tell him that he was banned. So there you have it, I've never actually told this whole story to anyone before, but writing it down now feels like a huge relief. It also means that I can show this to my fiancé later. I'm sure he'll get a real kick out of it. I don't know if there's any real moral to this story, but I urge anyone out there going through something similar to please make this behavior known to other people in your group. And if they don't take it seriously, you don't have to put yourself into a position where you feel unsafe. Thank you so much to everyone for listening, commenting, and messaging me. You're all awesome, and I appreciate you all so very much. Well, guys, first off, this one was an incredibly long one. This took me about 3 days to record, so I apologize if there's a little bit of inconsistency on audio quality. But onto my thoughts of the story. If you have anyone that is basically sexually harassing you, like the OP said, let it be known. Worst comes to worst, ditch the group. And if the person does exactly what this guy did and follows you to a place where you two should not be meeting unless it's by happenstance, you might need to start getting the police involved. Because at that point, it's stalking and harassment, and neither of those are okay. So I wish you luck and to have fun, and stay safe. But in any case, guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have a story that you'd like me to narrate, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching, and have a good one.